The vice president will be elected at the same time, blah, blah, blah. We now know that the big argument at the Constitutional Convention was what the executive was to look like, the architecture of it. Well, we now know it's one fashion. It's hierarchical, it's specialized, and it's a singular head. We've got one president, and he involves and embodies many roles.
You don't have to do them down. I can.
It's a long and very expensive process to get the job. There are 4 guys. There's a couple more.
I'm not even put it together.
Never before, since Jamestown and Plymouth Rock, has our American civilization been in such danger as now. We must be the great arsenal of democracy. For us, this is an emergency as serious as war itself.
The world will know that the first atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima.
I think the mass of the United States were rather pleased when they saw Batista having his troubles.
Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country.
We're not going to send our troops in there.
You don't have Nixon to kick around anymore.
I, Gerald R. Ford, have granted a full, free, and absolute pardon unto Richard Nixon.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
Those are in order, right? FDR to Truman, Truman to Eisenhower, Eisenhower to JFK, JFK to LBJ, LBJ to Richard Milhouse Nixon, Nixon gets fired, goes to Ford, Ford pardons him, and you get Carter, right? After Carter, you have Reagan. After Reagan, you have George H.W. Bush, the guy in the tan coat. After H.W. Bush, you have Bill Clinton, right there. After Bill Clinton, you have George W. And then, of course, President Obama is the current office holder. There it is. So we're going to describe the powers, the roles of the president, and explain a little bit, a quick review on the bureaucracy.
You, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, do solemnly swear.
I, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, do solemnly swear
That you will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States
And will, to the best of your ability,
and will, to the best of my ability,
preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States.
preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States.
So help you God.
So help me God.
You can see there's JFK here. LBJ's vice president behind him. That's Eisenhower. That's Vice President Nixon at the time. And these are all these senators and guests, etc. First ladies right there. This is required by the United States Constitution. As you can tell, because we have sound and moving parts, I did not make this PowerPoint. You really could say, that would wave because you know how to do that. Anyway, that's one of the constitutional powers of the president. Let's go through some of those and some of the informal powers. Number one, about the formal powers of the presidency. They're limited. There's only a few of them, 4 or 5. And yet conferred upon the presidency is enormous power. His number one job is to see that the laws be faithfully executed. He handles foreign policy. He's got the diplomatic power of recognition. He must provide the Congress with the State of the Union address. Most of them were historically done in writing. He is, by appointment power, another thing, the administrative president or administrator of our government. He sees that the laws and that these institutions that are of government carry out their function. He can veto pieces of legislation, which we'll talk about the legislative process in a minute. He has some law enforcement powers in that he can grant reprieves and pardons. The most popular or well-known pardon is, of course, Ford. There's also commutations that can shorten a length or give someone a reprieve. The current thing, but Let me just clarify something. Notice how Ford said a free, absolute, clear pardon, something like that, I'm paraphrasing. Implicit is if you accept a pardon, which I understand that there are some provisions you don't have to. You can either say, no, I'd rather not. If you accept a pardon, the implicit nature of that pardon means you're guilty. And I think that's what Ford thought when he pardoned Nixon. And Nixon was, by taking the pardon, admitting his guilt. Just to clarify. Some not enumerated informal powers that are not in the Constitution. The one that sticks out at me right away is the third one from the bottom, executive orders. An executive order, that ordinance power, is not in the Constitution. But it's a tool by which the president, which has the effect of law, can tell the government what it needs to be doing. And the other one is bully pulpit. The president's, as I said, it's got the biggest bullhorn in Washington. I mean, he's the guy that can call all the press together and give his announcements. So there are lots of, and by the way, executive agreement, his agreement with another, and then the cabinet. The custom of a cabinet, the top three at the time, Secretary of War, State, and Treasury, Hamilton, Jefferson, and Knox, started that. George Washington started that tradition. George Washington started a number of traditions that were informal. Some of them would be codified into law, others would remain them. Okay? One of them is the cabinet. All right, let's play the numbers game. When it comes to the
2 terms.
Thank you. 2 terms. 14 years. Where's your hint? I'm sorry? Yeah, right, residency. I think I told my crew that, I know Eisenhower was challenged on that, but you know he grew up here. 22.
Amendment.
22nd Amendment, which limits the president to 2 terms. 22, 2 terms. 25th Amendment.
Vice President succession.
Presidential succession. We know that in 1967, in the midst of a very cold War, we were worried about atomic bombs falling from the sky. And as a result of that, we needed to have a series of successions in case the president, vice president, speaker, president pro tem should ever be lost. 35 is
years minimum.
age. Current president is number 44. We've got 44. 44 times a head of a government went and left peacefully without war or civil war or tanks rolling on the streets or firing squads, went home and another dude came in, took over those enormous powers, and the government survived. We did it 44 times now. There are a lot of countries that usually the outgoing president is out back in front of a firing squad, and the new dude comes in as a dictator. And then he goes out by firing squad, and it begins again. So we've got a good tradition set by George and others that go. 270, of course, is the number of electors necessary to win. How many total electors are there? 538. Where do you get the number? Yeah, so 435 congressmen, 100 senators is 435. Where did the other 3 come from? Very good. District 4. All right. Among the different roles that the president does, and we did this about all the different hats the president wears, 6 are assigned by the Constitution. Number 1, the chief of state is a ceremonial head of the country. He is both king and prime minister. He lights the national Christmas tree, he gives medals to heroes, he throws out the first baseball pitch, he does all this. I would argue that chief of state is not throwing out the first baseball pitch. The reason I say that is because that's not a ceremonial function of government. I preserve that first role for a ceremonial function of government. Laying a wreath at the tomb of the unknown soldier is a head of state. Something the Queen would do. If you think chief of state, think of the Queen. Number 2, chief executives. See that the laws be faithfully executed. He enforces treaties, appoints federal judges. He oversees departments and agencies within the executive branch. He can't propose law. He can recommend law. Only a congressman can pass it. Number 4, he is the chief administrator. The government is made up of some 3 million employees, give or take. They spend around $3 trillion with a T dollars a year. He's the CEO heading one of the largest governmental machines on earth. I think Russia and China are the only ones picked. He's our main architect of foreign policy. He decides our country will act toward others. Obama's legacy, for better or for worse, we don't know, history will tell us, is he cut the Iran nuclear deal. Iran gave up the bomb in order to get off sanctions. He also opened the door to Cuba, which was shut after the Cuban Revolution and the rise of Fidel Castro and the Communist Party. The Communist Party's still there. Lots of European hotels. Europeans have been going to Cuba forever. We are now, we'll see if we're going to be fully invested. Who knows? There could be a hotel, an American hotel every 100 yards along the beautiful beaches of Cuba.
I have the authority. I am the Commander-in-Chief of the United States, and I say when we go to war.
That's from the movie 13 Days about the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Really?
What?
Because Congress declares war.
Well, he goes, well, I'll decide when we go to war, right? Congress was willing to authorize President Kennedy any option he wanted. He's yelling, actually, in that movie clip. It's a fictionalized representation. He's yelling at an Air Force general who wants to bomb now. You got to bomb them now. You got to get those missiles. And JFK says, no, we'll bomb when I say bomb, not before. By the way, just so you know, and I know you'll learn this in U.S. history, he was advised that there were no active missiles ready to fire. Long-range missiles. However, there were something 150, 160 long-range missiles, or short-range missiles, all ready to go. Had the U.S. Marines landed on Cuba, we had invaded that country. Castro had already authorized his military to nuke his own island. Think about that. To destroy our invasion. Can you believe that? That's one of those moments in history we just shudder. Oh my God, he would have nuked his own beach to kill our Marines. And God knows how many Cubans. There are there's less. There's a little bit less than 2 million, it's 1 point something million men and women in uniform who serve around the world, literally around the world. We not only would you find military presence on every continent, in every ocean and sea, you'll also find us under the water, and you'll find us up there, right, in space. We've got platforms from satellites and others that are most likely weaponized. I don't know. They didn't tell me when I asked. So, this power, by the way, let me just clarify. When it comes to Commander-in-Chief, it doesn't say, I'm Commander-in-Chief when Congress declares war. It doesn't say, I'm Commander-in-Chief only on Tuesdays and Thursdays and sometimes every other Sunday. It says, I'm Commander-in-Chief, period. He does not share that power with Congress. Every president says, I'm a unitary Commander-in-Chief. That means I'm the only one. I decide where the military goes. That's it. Which is why Congress felt the necessity to be back into that game with the War Powers Act, right? And they use their appropriation function on oversight of the military. Number 9, Chief Legislature. This really comes down to the legislative process and his role in it. He shapes congressional agendas. His veto is an enormously powerful tool to affect what goes on. 2,500 vetoes have been affected over the course of U.S. history, and about 104 have been overturned. What does that tell you? Veto threats and vetoes work. The president had said the latest bill about suing Iran, is it Iran? No, suing Iraq, or I can't remember. Oh no, I got it. Suing Saudi Arabia, excuse me, over the 9/11 hijackers. The president said he would veto that. All right, so the other two that are not mentioned in any way, shape, or form in the Constitution is chief of party. Right, the leader of the political party controls the executive branch. He's the fundraiser in chief, campaigner in chief. There are still some patronage jobs that the president can appoint, and they do that during the process of his moving in, but very few. We have transitioned away from the patronage and the spoil system because of the Pendleton Act to now a civil service system where you have to apply, prove qualifications, etc. Now, finally, chief citizen. He is our representative. He's expected to represent the work for the public interest. This is the one where I think he also provides that function of throwing out baseball pitches, being a moral leader, setting a good example, you know. And by the way, all of these, whether they're constitutional or not, have to be performed simultaneously. He does all of these things at any given time during the course of his presidency. So it's an enormously complicated job. He also does these. 2007, the housing market collapses, and with it is imploding the American economy. George W. Bush says, I'm not going to become the next Hoover. Takes a series of steps that have since become very controversial. He creates TARP, which is a Troubled Asset Relief Program, bails out the banks. Tea Partiers hated that. Obama comes in, and what he and the Democrats do right away? They stimulus package. You got to make sure that economy stays buoyant, or you're going to get blamed for it. Number two, another job. Mourner in chief. You die, I fly. If there's another world leader, God forbid should perish, generally the vice president is sent. Because the president doesn't want to overshadow and become a big pain in the butt. If, God forbid, the emperor in Japan should pass, before his son would, or daughter, or however the process works in Japan, before whoever the successor would take over as emperor, the vice president would fly in and pay our respects. Generally the president doesn't do that, but that doesn't mean he necessarily won't. And finally, campaigner in chief. We talked about this when we talked about chief of party. He's the primary fundraiser. Obama still has the ability to, to raise enormous sums of money. Oh, shoot.
I'm looking for the least possible amount of responsibility.
Well, you found it. It's called the vice presidency. What are his duties? He's only got two. Number one, preside over the Senate, president of the Senate. And number two is decide over help decide on presidential disability. I think it's the perfect job. You have to have all the qualifications of president and yet actually not be president. You have no actual function except to be alive and hang out, call the president, see if he's still alive, say, have a great day, I'm going to go play golf. Yes?
What was the second thing you said was his duty?
Preside over the Senate and decide on help decide on presidential disability. John Nance Garner said, these are all descriptions of the vice presidency. He said, this job is not worth a bucket of warm spit. That's a good one.
Man, you are one pathetic loser.
Number two, John Adams said, it's the most insignificant office that ever the invention of man can try or imagination conceive. He hated being vice president. Two reasons. One, the vice president cannot talk during debate nor vote. Try to get John Adams not to talk. That would have been a miracle. He couldn't stand that he couldn't enter debate in the Senate. 2, he couldn't vote, so he just stopped voting. He used to just sit there and read the paper and then leave. He got disgusted. And Washington didn't invite him to the cabinet meetings. When they walked into cabinet meetings, John would be like standing outside in the parlor, and George would poke his head out and say, "No, you cannot come in." And then off he would go. I was like, "Wow." I'm like, what the? Oh, okay, sorry. John Hay, couldn't wait to become president. Here's 2 more. If you had 2 sons and one went to sea, the other became vice president, neither would ever be heard from again. That's actually funny, guys. I am nothing, but I may be everything. Finally, here's a little picture of Daniel Webster.
It's alive!
You can probably tell why we stuck that quote, or they stuck that quote. If you look at Daniel Webster, there are 3 key figures in the early Republican Congress. The man who made all the deals, Henry Clay, he was from Kentucky or Tennessee. The guy that represented kind of the North was Daniel Webster. And he had a low baritone voice and his eyes were deep sunk in, and he would get up and these guys would talk on the floor of the Senate for hours, and people would actually listen. I talked for 50 minutes and the eyes roll in the back of your head, and you're like you're going to go comatose or go to a coma. The other guy, his main antagonist from the South, was a guy by the name of John C. Calhoun, who turned down the vice presidency. Let me say that again. He turned it down so he could stay in the Senate, because at the time the Senate was equal North-South states. He didn't want to give up his chance to fight for the South.
What?
Does anybody understand what the joke is? I know. Vice President Cheney is an avid hunter, or was an avid hunter. He goes off on a hunting trip. Bird flies up. He inadvertently swings the gun around and he shoots his partner. Shot the dude. Yeah, didn't kill him, just wounded him. So the vice president actually serves a couple of rules. One, the 25th Amendment puts him in the line of succession. He's not actually the second most powerful dude in Washington. He's Speaker of the House. He's clearly the second most powerful guy in Washington. He does political chores. The vice president can be the bad guy. He can get up and say whatever is on his mind. He can throw red meat, like Cheney, to get up and just say the most conservative things he could possibly think of. The Democrat, Republicans go, "Oh, I love that." And he would call every Democrat a complete idiot. And then, "Oh, we love that." He can do it because he's not the president. The president is supposed to look presidential. Supposed to look presidential. Let me say that. Finally, he balances the ticket. Brings electoral advantage to the person who wants to be president. Example, JFK is not friends with LBJ. They do not like each other. They are political rivals. And I mean that sincerely. They really, 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 really didn't like each other. But JFK has a close election against Nixon. He picks LBJ as the vice presidential candidate. What do they say about keeping your friends close and your enemies closer? Well, that's that right there. And he needed to win Texas. LBJ was a senator from Texas. And of course, you're a heartbeat away from the presidency. All right. Legislative outcomes. They're really quite simple. He either signs the bill or he doesn't. Right? If he vetoes it, congressional override is possible, but unlikely. He can wait 10 days and do nothing. If he does nothing, it automatically becomes a law, unless Congress adjourns. If Congress adjourns in that 10-day framework, all the things on his desk are automatically vetoed. That's called pocket veto. The line item veto, we know, is not a tool in the president's toolkit because it was ruled unconstitutional in Clinton versus Nixon. Okay? Oh, the other one is the idea of signing statements. The president attaches to any piece of legislation, as he signs it, how I'm going to enforce a law. All right, 2 rules of thumb about vetoes. 1 is veto threats work. If the president gets up and says, I will veto this, I promise. There's only 2 reasons why Congress would pass that law. If they want him to veto it, they're making a political stance, or they're going to have to make a deal. They'll have to take what the president will give in order for him to sign that piece of legislation. Or he will veto it, and then he'll say, go ahead, override it. 2/3 of both houses, particularly in this highly partisan atmosphere of politics today, is almost impossible. A little better numbers, 1,500 vetoes, 110 overrides. Bush had 11 vetoes, 4 of them were overridden. Obama has had 4, 0 have been overridden. Those are older, this is an older PowerPoint, so those numbers mean. All right, we're going to start that chart that looked like the galaxy, the swirling galaxy of the Milky Way as we go up. Remember, the president is the black hole of politics in the center of the universe. And as you go out from there, right, you get hopefully farther away from the president, less political. The presidency has grown so much. The 8 hats are all worn simultaneously. I have said for a long time, I think the president's job as it currently consists is almost impossible. No one person could possibly do that job. Which is why around him, starting about the time of FDR, at the time he's fighting a global war and dealing with a national meltdown, i.e. the Great Depression, his staff starts to explode. He creates what they call the Executive Office of the Presidency to help him do his job. Right? And so, more and more, the cabinet influence has diminished, and these guys and these institutions have grown in influence. Number 1 is the White House staff. Ability, loyalty. Those are the people he trusts, people he listens to, people who tell him A, do A, Y, and Z, and he'll do A, Y, and Z. Right? To help him do those things, on the foreign policy front, is the National Security Council. On that economic front, right? Global war, Great Depression, Council of Economic Advisors, and finally the OMB, which is the Office of Management and Budget. It's the bean counter. It's the one that keeps track of it. What is the government doing at any given time? Okay, the cabinet getting smaller in influence, White House staff getting greater. Sub-presidencies. Number 1 is domestic. If there's ever a place where Congress is on almost equal footing with the president, it's here. Right? They have oversight functions, they appropriate money, so they have enormous leeway in how the bureaucracy functions and works, and what it will do, what it will buy, what it won't do, and what it won't buy. This is the area where, if there's a question on the test, where might Congress be able to stand toward its own and even overcome presidential influence? It's here. Because in the next one, as I told you before, I forgot this, is the military. That's really where you shine, right? But when you think of fiscal policy, think of budgetary, tax, and spend. When you think of fiscal policy, think budgetary, tax, and spend. The president's concern to make sure that economy stays strong is fundamental to what he does for a living and how his approval rating and whether he gets reelected, etc. When you think monetary policy, think the Fed. That's interest rates. The Fed doesn't set interest rates per se, but it does set, it does set the discount rate, which is the rate that banks charge each other, and that ultimately will help influence other bank rates. Congress established the Council of Economic Advisors of the OMB to help the president keep track of this system and look at things we need to ameliorate in the economy, things we need to regulate or not regulate. But here's where the president is truly Tom Ridge made a statement that I found compelling and dangerous and kind of weird and scary all at the same time. He said, the American people have to get used to it. We are in a permanent state of war. If we are in a permanent state of war, if that's true, then this power never shuts off. Right? He is commander-in-chief. Alone. That's an enormous burden. 2, he operates with almost no obstruction from Congress. Other than the War Powers Act and a few things, other pieces of legislation. When the president decides that there's going to be a covert operation, that Delta team's going to drop out of the sky in Libya, or Navy SEALs are going to come on, emerge out of the water and walk onto Somali soil, he's the one that has ordered that mission. He's the one that put those Navy SEALs in those helicopters and ordered them to go and literally invade another country. He went into another country, violating their airspace. We land in the Abbottabad compound, we shoot and kill Osama bin Laden. We DNA him, we tag him and bag him, we throw him on the helicopters, and out we go before the F-16s, which they purchased from us, could lift off and shoot down the helicopters with our guys in it. Right? Now everybody says, well, you should thank the SEALs. Yes, I do, but who gets credit? Whether you like it or not, the president gets credit. If that were to go, if that would have gone horribly bad, like Operation Eagle Claw did for Jimmy Carter, our hostages were in Iran. Carter orders a rescue operation that ends tragically when a couple of our helicopters collide in the desert as we're trying to go get to our people. It ends up in a disaster. And that's Carter's fault. Now, he wasn't in the desert. He didn't crash the helicopters, but he's president at the time. So, for better or for worse, if a good thing happens on your watch, it's you get the credit. If it's bad something on your watch, tough, it's still your fault. And the American people get to decide, not you. Which is why, don't think for a second Obama's not thinking about his historical legacy, particularly in this regard. Because right now, I believe he's the #1 terrorist killer in the world. Keeping score, but lots of drones are flying all over the world as we speak, dropping Hellfire missiles on suspected terrorists, worldwide. Constraints on the president. Some are formal. In this case, the Constitution gives him things he can do. Federalism. You know, he can't order the Army to go invade Rhode Island, as much as he might like. He needs law. President George H.W. Bush needed Congress and the governor of California for his blessing so that he could send Marines into L.A. during the L.A. riots in the 1980s. Huge riots in L.A. The president could have just ordered the Marines to go in like that, but he had to go through all these legal hoops in order to make that legit. All right, Congress, for its appropriations, can just say we're not going to make that military uniform unit anymore. The courts can stop him. The court system right now is deciding whether Obama's immigration executive order is legit. They can shoot that sucker down tomorrow. I don't know what their decision is going to be. He knows all too well that there are way more Republicans in the House and the Senate than there are Democrats. He's outnumbered. His legislative agenda is on hold. They're waiting for him to go away. And I bet probably by now Obama can't wait to get out. And what's a first-term president want more than anything? A second term. What does a second-term president want? Reviewed favorably in the history books, because you and I are going to read about them. When your kids are your age, they're going to say, hey, who was this President Obama dude we'll read about in chapter 12? Oh, I remember. All right, other constraints. Think of the bureaucracy as a giant cruise ship. It's hard for the captain of a cruise ship to get everybody on the same page and do what they're supposed to do. And as you read presidential history, Nixon fought with the bureaucracy. The Department of State hated Nixon and he hated them. And every time he gave them an order, they would do it really slowly or if not at all. They would reinterpret his orders and he thought them pretty direct. And that happens to anything that can happen right? The media could just rip you in the media. How'd you like to be president? You get ripped every day. I'm sure there's one media outlet that's ripping the president as we speak. That would be hard for me to do. Interest groups, world leaders, Putin. We have 12,000 guys in Poland right now for a big military exercise. Don't think the Russians don't know it and are protective about it. Which is why the Russians do these provocative acts. They're not being petulant children. They're letting us know how they are unhappy they are about our actions and what they consider their neck of the woods. The staff, sometimes the president lives in a bubble. The staff is saying you can't do X or Y because you need to get reelected, as much as you might like. Often he's constrained by that reelection impetus. All right, how does he get his work done? Well, he can issue executive orders. We know the infamous one, FDR issues executive order 9066, Japanese internment. Truman orders desegregation of the United States military. Clinton orders don't ask, don't tell. It's about if you were a homosexual in the military prior to don't ask, don't tell. If they found out you were gay, you were kicked out. And this one, he ordered the U.S. military not to ask. And if you are homosexual, not to tell, and it would be fine. Right now, that rule's out the window. And of course, President Bush did a faith-based initiative where he worked with faith-based institutions to implement policy. So all of them have executive orders. I forgot the big one right there. JFK, of course, uses executive order to start the peace corps. And there's executive agreements. The executive agreement is a way to circumvent Congress because it doesn't require Senate approval like the treaty does. It's only valid while you're president. My historical example that I always like to use is that the Lend-Lease Act started out as an executive agreement between Franklin Delano Roosevelt, made an executive agreement with Winston Churchill. We would lease them, lend them Navy ships, and they would lease us some bases in the Atlantic, the Azores. So that Lend-Lease Act would later become law, but it started as an executive agreement between us and the British. And then there's executive privilege. It's the idea that the presidency needs candid advice. Candid advice can often be politically unappealing, and so he prefers that it be done in private. So he can say that my records of what I'm working on are secret, so to be kept to myself. We know that Nixon tried that ploy, and they found out the House investigating him for wrongdoing. His lawyer gets up and says, oh yeah, President Nixon tapes everything. And they went, what? And so the House subpoenas all the tapes. And of course Nixon says, no, we will give it to you as executive privilege. The Supreme Court says, yes, you will. He loses qualified executive privilege, not absolute. The tapes give up the ghost. He finds out that he's a crook. He's going to get kicked out, so he quits. This whole idea that separation of powers, Congress can't investigate it under. Like I said, the president has a bully pulpit. He's got a bullhorn that he can use to influence not only members of Congress, but the American electorate. He can go over the heads of Congress and put public pressure on Congress to fulfill a certain policy. I think one of the best presidents of this was Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan.
His face should go on Mount Rushmore.
Okay, maybe not. But Ronald Reagan was confronted by a House entirely controlled by Democrats and a Senate controlled by Democrats. And he wanted to pass his policy agenda and his budgets. So he said, fine, Congress, I'm going over your head. He went to the American people. He made a series of speeches across the country. And you would not believe the amount of political pressure average Americans would put on their congressmen to make the deal. And the Democrats, by the way, did. They would say they compromised with the president in order to fulfill the budgetary rule. President sending signals to Congress. The key is picking the right issue. George W. Bush, re-elected for president, gets up and the first thing he says is, I'm going to sell reform of Social Security. And I'm going to spend, this is a quote, I'm going to spend political capital to do it. And guess how that turned out? Not so much. All the political capital he spent got him nowhere. Touching Social Security was just too controversial at the time. his own Republicans were like, what are you doing? Why are we picking this battle? We're not dying on this hill. Right? So knowing how to shape public opinion and where and what issues to die on that hill for are an important part. And I think Reagan knew that pretty well. Obviously, Bush got that one wrong. All right, the bureaucracy. Congress, the President, and judicial pronouncements to develop procedures and rules for implementing public policy. When I think of the Article 2, I think of the executive in its entirety, right? Not just the presidency, and let's go outside that swirl. Not just as the executive office of the president or staff. To go outside, I call them the gas giants. The big giant institutions of the federal government. Think of Saturn and Pluto, and think of these characters. This is the cabinet level departments, right? Those guys who head those secretaries of Interior, Health and Human Services, etc. They all split their allegiance between their own agencies, which they become cheerleaders for, and the president who they take directives from. Right? Offices have been lifted to cabinet level status. One of them is the Office of the Trade Rep, U.S. Trade Rep. Mr. Smith, was it Zellick?
Robert Zellick?
Zellick, right?
Yeah, yes.
The U.S. Trade Rep. Guess where Mr. Zellick grew up and went to school? Right here in Naperville Central High School. He's a graduate of Naperville Central High School. Some teachers that have recently retired were good friends of his. He was elevated by Bush to cabinet level agents, which I thought was pretty cool. You're nominated by the president, confirmed by the Senate. Right, we're not talking belly buttons here when we talk about innies and outies. There are some guys who are close to the president that he listens to, and others that are more detached, more done for political purposes, or for autocratic purposes.
Hey, really quickly, if you're particularly a first semester person, and you are coming on Saturday night, and you have your $5, can you kind of sit back here?
Yeah, go back and pay Mr. Smith.
If you're second semester, you can, but you also just get that to either of us in class. But first semester, you don't see that.
All right. Generally, guys, confirming members of the cabinet, the secretaries of the different agencies have been relatively easy historically. Justice Department, not so much. They have been relatively controversial because the Justice Department sometimes is seen as a political instrument of one party or the other, whichever. The Republicans claim that the Democrats under Obama are using it for political purposes. Farther out on our spiral is independent regulatory commissions. These guys regulate a sector of the economy, one small part of it. They have these quasi-governmental powers, quasi-executive, quasi-legislative, and quasi-judicial. They decide how law will be implemented, what regulations they'll write to make sure that laws are implemented, and that they're the ones who issue a fine if you break the law. Right? The Nuclear Regulatory Agency tells nuclear power plants how to run nuclear power plants. If they don't do it the way they want, you get fined. And because these branches are headed by commissions of usually 4 to 7 people that get their job for a fixed term and can only be fired with cause, why do they do that? So that they are free of political influence. Some of these commissions, the best known ones, the big one is obviously the Federal Reserve Board. This Yellen is the head of the Federal Reserve Board. Many people think the president controls the Fed. He does not. It's an independent agency. He can influence it, but he doesn't control it. 3 other big ones. Remember monetary policy, that's interest rates. The Federal Communications Commission, what you see on TV, the bandwidth you have for your phone, it's all controlled by the FCC. Federal Trade Commission, and the Securities and Exchange. If you buy stocks and bonds, if you buy a retirement instrument, if you go out and buy insurance, it's all controlled by Securities and Exchange, especially if you own a stock or a bond. Right, these agencies regulate certain sectors of the economy. And then there's these guys, also independent. President nominates, Senate confirms, serve at the pleasure of the President. They usually do a specific function. They don't regulate per se, but they can. These are the four most well-known. Obviously, this one right here we will all know, because you've all seen the spy movie. Central Intelligence Agency has one client. That client is the President of the United States. My favorite is NASA. That's the one where you deal and negotiate with with other planets. Where the NASA is where they control alien bodies at Area 51. Where we reverse engineer UFOs. It's all done by the NASA. And the other one, which is either looked at very favorably or very unfavorably, is the Environmental Protection Agency. These are the guys that were created during the Clean Air Act under Nixon, a Republican, to help keep our nation clean, right? Along with Department of the Interior and other stuff. We all know about government corporations. The most important thing about them is that they're self-financing. The most important of which, the most well-known, or it's well-known government institution that most people don't know is a government corporation. Most people think post office dude is still run by the president. It's not. Right? Your taxes do not go to the post office. You have the FDIC, Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. Banks pay a small fee for being insured. They pay a premium. And of course, Amtrak. I call it, it's the airline for the poor. It's basically what it is. I don't think it's made money ever. And yet the government keeps it around. All right, what is the power of the bureaucracy? Well, they have to implement whatever the law says they're supposed to do. Right? They have the power to fill in the blanks. And that's called discretionary authority. The power to, okay, go clean the air, EPA. Well, how? Well, that's up to you. You figure out how to clean the air, and then you tell Congress how you're going to do it. ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or Border Patrol. You guys guard the border. You tell me how you're going to do it. Right? That's discretionary authority. Congress gives discretionary authority, the President gives discretionary authority to those agencies to do their work. They also have delegated authority. The power to fill in the blanks because Congress and the President have too much to do, so they delegate authority to make the decision. And you have to know both, and use both of them. Discretionary authority and delegated authority. The regulations have the force of law because they've been authorized by congressional statute that they have the force of law. So all those little rules and red tapes that they talked about. There's one with pathology. Remember that? Race, duplication, imperialism, all those pathologies you read about when you read about the bureaucracy. One of them is red tape. And red tape is, just like I said, anytime you take math, the teacher in the math class always says you have to show your work. You and I just want to get to the right answer, write the right answer, and move on. The bureaucrat doesn't have the right or the power to not fill in the blanks and show their work. Fragmentation. There are 100 welfare programs administered by 10 different departments. So that's that whole idea of duplication. Overlap, review different things. Health and Human Services was responsible for AFDC, which is now AFDC stands for Aid to Families with Dependent Children. They now instituted welfare reform. They now have 10, which is temporary aid to needy families. Housing and Urban Development did housing. The Department of Agriculture did food stamps. The Department of Labor did job training. All of these are welfare programs run by the government, trying to get people off the dole and on the job. So that's another pathology fragmentation. All of these agencies are involved with just regulating the manufacture and sale of right? Human Exchange Commission, the Labor Relations Board, the workers in the factory, Department of Labor, once again, back to Labor, Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, how they treat their employees, Department of Transportation, what kind of regulations about how a car, what does a car have to have? I'll see if we can have. EPA, what kind of stuff comes out the back of that car. The Federal Trade Commission, how they deal with National Highway Transportation Safety Authority, making cars safe. All of those, just in regards to one area of the economy, car production. Mr. Smith always uses this, I don't use it as much as I probably should, is the iceberg analogy. Of the top jobs, about 500 are nominated by the President, confirmed by the Senate. About 2,500 lesser positions. The rest are by skill or merit, are supposedly non-political. They're career staffers and civil servants. As I stated before, many times in my class, I asked the guy how long he worked for the government. He said 4 presidents. He goes, how long have you worked at Central? I said 3 principals. Which tells you the thing. Civil servant, government staffers, you know, that's their career, guys. They're going to spend 20, 30 years doing that job. Presidents, for them, come and go. Next president's going to come in. He may mix things up a little bit, but he'll be gone soon enough. And a new picture goes on, right? A lot of these guys outlast top appointed officials. It's not patronage anymore. I believe what they used to say about icebergs, iceberg at sea, you only see like 10% of it at the top. Is it 10? All right. The Office of Management and Budget. It is the largest of the executive office of the president offices. It's the one that does the budgets. It is the bean counters for the president. It is the one that receives all of the budget requests from all of the different agencies and mushes them all together and prepares a budget for the president. The president says, here are my top priorities. Make that align with your budgetary responsibility. Circulars dictate agency management practices. Prepare the budget. That's the most important. Okay. Are there any questions? I got you out on time, 4:15, that was my goal. I met my goal. If I got a little early, you're welcome. Have a wunderbar day. Does anybody need a late bus pass? Come hither.
I'm gonna check with my mom.
Search, yes. They circle around the memo.
What'd you say? Things you should get.
What are they like for?